Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual information session. And thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I know that there are a lot of things that compete for your time and attention, particularly at this time of year. Your interest in the Lincoln Area Creeks Floodplain Mapping Initiative, and of course, in your community and in your own properties, is very much appreciated. I do a fair bit of this kind of work, and it's my personal belief that people who, like yourselves, who take time out of your busy personal and professional lives to contribute constructively to matters of civic and societal interest are always most deserving of our gratitude and respect. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward, as I'm sure do you, to a productive session. Let me introduce myself. For those of you whom I've not yet met, my name is Glenn Pache. I'm the head of a firm called GLPI, and it's my pleasure to serve as the independent facilitator for the meeting. Again, it might be important for you to know that I am not an employee of the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, that is the NPCA for short, nor am I an employee of any of the engineering consultants that have been retained to assist with this mapping initiative. The only bias I bring to the meeting, if I can call it a bias, is toward achieving the best result for us all, and that's what I will set out to do. So I'll introduce some others in a couple of minutes, but first let's talk about what it is that we are up to this evening. As you'll likely recognize, this study is important given that its outcomes will help protect both public and private property that is at risk from flooding. And more importantly, it will reduce risks to personal safety. And of course, managing flood risks begins with identifying the areas that are flood prone. So what we're going to be up to tonight is as follows. We'll have an overview presentation covering a bunch of things. It'll include a definition of a floodplain and the notion of a 100-year flood event. We'll hear about how floodplains are modeled and the approaches used and the activities that are undertaken. We'll hear about hydrologic modeling and an explanation of how all of that works. And we'll talk about how all of this translates into the floodplain mapping itself, including overviews of the recommendations for different areas. Oh, and we'll also hear about the legislative context, including relevant NPCA policies and what the floodplain lines mean for people and for their property. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity to share questions of fact or clarification. And then after the Q&A and the discussion, we'll talk about next steps and other opportunities to continue to stay engaged, to ask questions, or to share comments. And by the way, the NPCA invites you to visit the project website to review the draft report and the associated maps. And I'll read this out now. It will be up on screen later. I'm going to go slowly because it's a long website address, but if you have a pen or paper handy, or if you want to key this into your computer or whatever device you're using, it is https:/// so two of them there. So again, https://getinvolved.npca.ca/Grimsby Lincoln floodplain mapping. Again, we will put that on screen for you later, but that's one way to get additional information and to stay engaged. Or you can contact Steve Miller, whom I'll introduce shortly. He's the NPCA Senior Manager of Water Resources, and he can be reached at smiller@npca.ca. Again, that's smiller@npca.ca. And again, we'll have all of that back on screen for you a little bit later. So to be respectful of your time, we're looking to wrap up the meeting in its entirety by no later than 8 o'clock. And again, just to be clear, and I think everybody is, tonight's meeting is focused on the Beamsville Creek, the Bartlett Creek, and the Prudhommes Creek floodplain mapping initiative. This meeting is not about any and everything that may bug you about the NPCA or living in the region. Those are issues that can be addressed outside of this meeting through other means or in other forms. Now, having said that, the NPCA very much looks forward to the open sharing of information and to a constructive dialogue. And of course, they appreciate any value-adding questions that can help result in the best initiative outcome. So as I said, at the end of the presentation segment, we'll be inviting questions of fact or clarification on our topic. The NPCA team will address as many questions as there is time for in the session. We'll also again outline a range of opportunities that are available to you for providing additional comments and ideas. I'll also note that some people did send some questions in advance of the meeting, and our speakers will try to address many of them during the presentation, or we might tackle a few of them in the latter part of the meeting where we're dealing with the Q&A portion. I do want to emphasize, though, that the team is not addressing individual property-specific or site-specific items today. These can be addressed post-session to the NPCA project manager. Again, I'll introduce Steve shortly, and we'll provide his email address again a little bit later. So before we go on, a few words about the nature of this WebEx session. And I know some of you are experts. You've been using this platform many times over the last number of months as we've been working in this COVID operating environment. But for others, it might be their first time. So let me go through a few key pieces of important information. First of all, the session is being recorded. And this is being done for a few reasons. First of all, so that the NPCA will have something to which they can refer when they're creating their event summary. But more importantly, the recording will be placed on the project website for others to view who may not have been able to join us this evening. And again, for those of you who have not used WebEx, I'll briefly describe the functionality of this webinar. As an attendee in the webinar, you cannot be seen and you cannot be heard by us or by anyone else participating. We invite you to please send your questions as they occur to you throughout the session by using the question and answer function. That is the Q&A function, typically found on the panel at the right side of the bottom of your device. If you haven't already opened the Q&A function, I encourage you to do so now by clicking on, and you may have to click on the three dots icon. Again, that's typically found at the bottom right of your screen. The Q&A function should pop up, and then within the Q&A function, please ensure, and this is important, that you select the NPCA chat moderator. That's the NPCA chat moderator as the person to whom to send your questions. This is really important. Please only send your questions to the NPCA chat moderator. Questions sent that way will only be seen by the NPCA, and this is your way to engage with us during the session. Again, questions can only be submitted using the Q&A function, and our moderator will queue up the questions to put to our responder panel during, again, the question and answer part of the webinar. If you have any technical issues, please email them to sebastian@skycomp.ca. So that's Sebastian spelled SEBASTIEN at skycomp, that's SKYCOMP and Sebastian will do his very best to assist you. For those of you who may have simply chosen to dial into the meeting, in other words, you are using a simple phone and not a computer or web-enabled device, you'll be able to listen to the presentation, but not share any questions. So if you're following the presentation, perhaps using a hard copy or something that's on the NPCA website, our presenters will perhaps occasionally reference the slide numbers or titles so that you can better follow along. So again, I know I've said this a few times, but it's really important. If you have any questions about anything you're hearing in the presentation, or perhaps that's not in the presentation, but that is relevant to our subject matter this evening, please forward those questions through the Q&A function as they occur to you. Do not wait until after the presentation. Send them as they occur to you. If due to time constraints your question is not addressed this evening, please be assured that it will be considered in the NPCA staff documentation of questions and comments that are received as part of the initiative. So let me quickly introduce a few people. First, I understand that we may have some of our esteemed elected officials and NPCA board members joining us. If so, welcome. It is great to have you in the virtual house, so to speak. I did want to take a moment to introduce the team that you will be hearing from today, either as presenters of information or as potential responders to your questions. So we have a number of NPCA staff. And I will introduce them quickly. We have Darren McKenzie, who's a director of watershed management. Darren is not on camera at the moment. We also have Steve Miller, who's a senior manager of water resources, and again, the NPCA's project manager for the initiative. You just saw Steve wave, so you can put a face to the name. We also have David DeLuce, who is the senior manager planning and regulations, and David's on screen now. He just gave us a quick wave. And then from a firm called Aquaphor Beach that is assisting the NPCA with this initiative, we have Dave Maunder, who is a principal with the firm and the consulting team project manager. And of course, we have all of you, the members of the public, without whom this meeting wouldn't make much sense. So in the interest of time, let's move to our next agenda item. As mentioned, we're going to begin with an overview presentation. Dave Maunder, again from Aquaphor Beach, the firm working with the NPCA, will take us through the first component of the material. Then Steve Miller and David DeLuce from the NPCA will share some information as well. Again, as questions occur to you, this is really important, send them during the presentation, send them through the Q&A function. Do not wait until the end. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. I'm looking forward to a really constructive and productive session. And Dave, over to you to start us off, please.
Thanks, Glenn. I'll just pull up the presentation. Can people see the presentation? First question.
Yes, I can see it, Dave.
Okay, thanks. So as noted on the title slide, the objective tonight is to talk about the floodplain mapping in the town of Lincoln. The reason the word update is used, that approximately 30 years ago, initial floodplain mapping was undertaken for NPCA. So trying not to get too technical, what is a floodplain? So if you were to cut a cross section through the ground or through the earth, floodplain represents the estimated extent of water coverage during a specific event. As Glenn mentioned, within the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, the 100-year flood is the standard event that's used to define the floodplain. And in theory, a 100-year event has a 1% chance of occurring every year. So just to give you an idea, I mentioned before that if you took a vertical cut through the earth, you see the channel and you see what's referred to in the green as the floodplain banks. What we do have is when it rains in a rural area, a lot of the water actually infiltrates into the ground or is taken up by trees, but the remaining water will get to a stream. And in that stream, for a given amount of water, depending on how wide the channel is or what type of watercourse crossings we have, the water will rise to a certain elevation. So basically, the floodplain at each location within a computer model provides the water surface elevation for the 100-year event. If you're inside the regulated flood line, you're called to be within the floodplain, and if you're outside of it, you're outside of the floodplain. So as was mentioned, we're looking at Beamsville, Konkle, Bartlett, and Prudhommes Creek tonight. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 20 minutes just walking through some of the technical aspects, but I want to save at least 10 minutes to the end just to refer to the individual properties or sites or locations that may be in the floodplain, and just to show you what kind of measures can be done to remove or potentially alleviate flood problems within the floodplains. So what did we do? We undertook a lot of field work to make sure that our findings are actually reasonably founded. And then, as Glenn mentioned, we run a hydrologic and hydraulic model. Hydrology basically is the science of determining how much water is at a given location, and hydraulics is for that given amount of water and the stream cross-section, how high does it rise? Why do we want to know this? Well, there's roadways that would hopefully be dry for smaller events and for relatively larger events. But if structures were built a long time ago and they're undersized, chances are they may back water up. And as you'll see in some of the locations, in some cases, the buildings are just built very close to the floodplain, so they will be flood susceptible for the 100-year event. Once we've identified the problems, then what we want to do is look at recommendations to mitigate the impacts of flood hazards on roads, buildings, and structures. And then what we've put together near the end is a preliminary cost to implement the proposed works. These works could be implemented by the municipality over time, in part by the Conservation Authority, and in some cases, individual homeowners may need to put some money into it. So I mentioned before that there's basically 6 tasks to this. I'll just go over the initial tasks. And again, we're just looking at a representative stream in the area. And what we did is we went into the field, we looked at structures, we measured the size, the cross-section of the structures, their location, and we took cross-sections through the channels to make sure that the information from tasks 1 and 2 are representative for the hydrologic model. And then what we did is once we have the flows at a given location, we figured out the water surface elevation. And ultimately, so what our deliverables are, a series of floodplain maps, and together with a recommendation for how we can mitigate floodplain issues wherever possible. Just a representative example, if you look at this, I won't get into too much detail, but you can see, if I can bring the mouse over, what we have here is a representative channel, and at the downstream limit, we have a relatively small culvert. So what we're trying to do is figure out when it rains, does the water stay within the channel? Does it overtop into the banks? Or does it overtop onto the roadway first? So what we did is we actually went out and documented relevant information for each of the structures that are within the watercourses. We mentioned before that we used a hydrologic model. I won't get into that too much, but basically what we're trying to do again is to estimate flows for a 100-year design storm. And what we also do is we estimate flows based on existing conditions, but within most municipalities, they have an official plan. The official plan in this circumstance is for the year 2031. So we want to figure out what the floodplain is now, but we also want to know what it is for the future. And the primary reason for that is that as development occurs, typically when you develop lands, there's more runoff coming from those properties, and therefore the floodplain may increase. So the town of Lincoln provided us with existing conditions and just a snapshot. So what you see here in the brown areas are areas within the municipality that are deemed for development. And this is a broad scale look at it. And then if you look at it more closely, it tells us what type of land use is proposed. We take all this information to input it into the model to try and, again, figure out what the flows are currently and what they will be for ultimate conditions, which is 2031. to give you an idea, if you look at each of the catchments, just a general thing here. So what we clearly need to do, if you look at any given, so the brown line you see is the subwatershed. So basically anything within this rectangle you see here will drain within that subwatershed and work its way downstream. What we wanted to do, you see a bunch of blue dots. So all we're trying to do is define flows at different locations. And clearly in the headwater areas, you won't nearly have as much flow as you will toward the mouth where they discharge to Lake Ontario. So we need to define at a variety of locations what the flow rate is, and then we input that information into the hydraulic model. So what we've done is we've shown a snapshot here of some of the flows. So I just want to explain what some of the values are. So we have the watersheds, so Prudhomme Creek, Bartlett Creek, Beamsville, or Konkle. And what we have here is a 100-year design flow. CMS is a cubic meter per second. So it's a rate of flow that we're looking at. So in 1989, I'll just use Bartlett as an example. What they found in 1989 is the flow rate was about 25.1 cubic meters a second. And under ultimate development, that flow was about 34.6 cubic meters a second. The 1989 ultimate conditions are pretty similar to what we would have for existing conditions now, given the 30-year time lapse. And you can see here what we're finding is that our flows of 32.7 are very similar to the original flows that were done. And Steve's going to talk about the implications of this study being done some 30 years later and how it may change and revise some of the floodplains that we've been using for years. So again, these numbers aren't precise. They're rounded to one decimal place, but you're happy if your values are plus or minus 20%. And again, I mentioned before that we're trying to do them for existing conditions and for future conditions. So you'll see in Bartlett that once development continues on, that there will actually be a higher flow, which will result in a higher floodplain or more expansive floodplain. So I'll just go through this one quickly. I'll just try and show you what we're doing. And again, I mentioned, so this is the stream. So for those flows are going this way. Watercourse crossing, so a culvert or a small bridge to that lake. And what the blue represents is you take a cross section where you see, for example, that brown line there. We take cross sections at representative locations through the watercourses. And what we're trying to do for the 100-year storm is to figure out how wide the water will be. And typically you'll see when I show the results, water typically backs up behind the culverts. Typically the culverts are less able to convey flows than a typical channel can. So what you're seeing here, this line I'm showing here, is the extent of the flood line. So this is just one of a number of maps we produce. But again, if we look at it at any one given location, what is the flow rate? How much does the water back up? And then we define the flood line. We define them at strategic locations, and then basically we form a continuous line by interpreting between the different locations. I have one example here. We produced a series of maps, 30 or 40, I believe, in the area. So just again, to give you an idea what you're looking at. So a major road running across the QEW. The blue line is the watercourse itself, and the yellow line is the representative 100-year flood line. And again, we have done it for all of the streams we discussed, and we've done it basically from the mouth, working upstream to usually with the smallest drainage area we look at is typically in and around 120 hectares. So again, the important thing as you go through it is to see the yellow line. So everything within this line is deemed to be within the floodplain. Anything outside of that line, for example, this building, is what's referred to as outside of the flood line. So what we did is you'll see in a moment, we have a number of flood hazard areas, which were done once we did the floodplain mapping. And a flood hazard area is a building within the floodplain or a structure, culvert or bridge. So clearly, if there's a building in the floodplain, we'd like to know where it is and its frequency for flooding. And also what we like to do for the municipalities is to define, are the culverts or the bridges appropriately sized? And if not, what is the implication of those and what can we do about it down the road? So what we did is we looked at alternative flood relief options, and we evaluated a number. So the first thing is structural floodproofing, and this is something that's typically done by individual residences. So this could be providing a berm or regrading around your property, or trying to maybe block off low openings like window wells and stuff like that in your basement if and when a large storm comes. What the municipality or the conservation authority can do is try and upgrade a culvert. If a culvert's, say, 1 meter by 1 meter, maybe it has to be 1 meter by 4 meters to allow more water through it. If it allows more water through it, then hopefully you'll reduce the water that's behind it. You can put a dike or a berm in. You can put a water course. You know, if a water course itself is limiting in capacity, then you can actually try and widen it or deepen it or do something like that. And you'll actually see in our examples, there has been 2 recent water course improvements that have been done that will take both reduce the floodplain and take some of the properties outside of the floodplain. So in this particular area, we have 23 flood hazard areas that were identified in the streams as mentioned. So we found that we could recommend 12 flood remediation works that would address 14 of the flood hazards. So by doing a little bit of math, that means that 9 properties will still remain flood susceptible. We just couldn't find anything that could be done within the public domain to reduce that. So we'll talk about structural flood proofing by the landowner for those remaining 9 properties. So I'm just going to quickly walk through in about the last 10 minutes what we've tried to show here. And again, I'll just take a moment. So this is Green Line Road. And again, the flows are going this way. They're moving from the bottom to the north. And again, what you're seeing here is the flood line. So I mentioned before, typically, if this culvert's very small, what happens is the water, when it starts to come, backs up a little bit, still can't get there, backs up, and backs up. And typically what's happening here is for the 100-year storm, what's happening is over Green Lane is that, the water will overtop the road. So what we've suggested, if you look here, you'll see the flood hazard area, a description of the issue, a proposed solution, and a general cost to do it. So what we're saying here is the issue is that Green Lane crossing, the culvert is too small, the structure is too small. So what we're recommending to do is to increase the capacity. And basically, in a lot of cases, we're probably trying to put a culvert in there that's 2 or 3 times its original capacity. So what we're saying here is if you did do that, put a new culvert in if and when that road's redone, then what we would do is we would reduce the frequency of overtopping of the road, and we would also bring in significantly the line that is upstream of the culvert. So I mentioned here, we did the study. Our study was finished about 1.5 years ago. Steve can add to this, but since that time, because of the very wide floodplain here, they've actually done what's called channel relocation. So this channel before would have been what's referred to as very poorly defined. So what they've tried to do is provide some structure, put some banks in, and the intent is what they've tried to do here is bring this yellow line in as close as we can to the creek on both sides. So this area, again, Steve will address it if there's any particular questions on this area. This work was done to reduce the flood line and to bring it in substantially just downstream of Green Lane. So at Bartlett, again, a lot of the recommendations are just increasing culvert capacity side. And in this one here, so what you see in red, if you see a number B4, I mentioned before there's 23 buildings that are flood susceptible. So this is one of them. Now, again, in this area, what we've talked about is increasing the capacity of this culvert here. Again, you can see it's about 6 cubic meters or square meters now, and we have to increase it to about 14 or 15 square meters. The wider the culvert, the more water that will get in for a given elevation, and there's a cost there of $330,000. And similar to the other area, what has been done here, again, this is after our study was completed, is that the flood line has been brought in, and the intent is to bring it in to about this proximity here and here, again, by expanding the channel width such that this structure here, this building, will no longer be within the floodplain. So again, we have one again at John Street, and it's the same. You're seeing the same kind of issue, undersized culverts. And for those who might wonder, I mean, a lot of these culverts were built many years ago. The standards have increased for probably, if the same culvert was built today, it would be bigger, wider and deeper in all likelihood. And also some of them were built before urbanization occurred upstream. So that results, there's two basic reasons why the culverts, when they originally built, may not have been large enough. So again, what we have here is an increase in the culvert capacity for John Street. Again, some of them are fairly similar, so I'll just try and speed up through some of them. So at Acres Trace, again, a small undersized culvert. Again, what we have here now, structures that are downstream of a culvert, water backs up upstream. So these two structures here, you'll see later on, there was nothing we felt we could do in the stream or upstream that would take these two structures, these two homes outside of the floodplain. So there would have to be structural measures done there. So you'll see those measures at the end of the presentation. So there are some locations where there are private buildings, and we thought, for example, where you see BK3 here, so these two buildings, we did feel that there was an opportunity, as you saw on a couple of those previous slides, to widen or deepen the water course and take these two buildings out of the floodplain. So channel works with some structural floodproofing would remove, in some cases, these two structures here. What we have along here is there's a partial retaining wall and a poorly defined stream, and both a building and a long, large parking lot that's in the floodplain. So we thought here what could be done is there's not much of an opportunity to increase the channel width, but possibly a retaining wall or some similar structure could be put in along here to, again, bring this property and associated building outside of the floodplain. Some of them we're looking at in some of these areas, we're literally here looking at a ditch that's running along the road. And the ditch, as you can see, is very undersized. So the floodplain becomes very wide. So what we're talking about here, literally, and these would almost be operation and maintenance works that would be done by the municipality, but there is the possibility of improving the capacity of this local ditch. And if we did that, we could remove these two homes and take them outside of the floodplain. Again, we're looking at Laurie Avenue. Again, what we have here is an increase. If we can increase the size of this, we'll bring this floodplain in again. And what that would do is, we refer to it as property P1. As you can see, the flood line's kind of running through the middle of the house. What we would hope to do is be able to bring the flood line in by increasing that capacity so that this house again would be outside of the floodplain. We mentioned another location on Green Line Road, and I'll go through a couple of these quickly, that just overtopping again at Green Line. So again, another culvert increase. And again, at Rittenhouse Road, the same thing. And the thing here is, again, so where'd my mouse go? There we go, sorry. So what we can do here, in some cases, all you're doing is bringing the floodplain in, but in this case, the hope would be to put a large enough culvert in that these two properties, these two homes here, would be taken out of the floodplain. So the last couple of minutes I have are just to talk. So we had 23 properties that were identified. I did identify one that works have subsequently been done since we started, or since we finished the study. So there were 9 properties that we didn't feel anything could be done by the municipality or public works. And that was just because we didn't feel we had the room. And in some cases, for example, look at these two homes here. They're just very close to the stream. So what would have to be done here is there's nothing we can really do to bring that flood line basically way over here so that these two properties would no longer be flood prone. So what we're talking here is about structural measures. And again, I think it's probably best if there's questions, Steve would probably address those. But the structural measures, as I said, you might try and potentially put a berm in and around your property. You need to be careful when that is done that you don't inadvertently impact somebody else. So there are 9 properties in total. We've shown 3 of them on here. I'll just quickly go through them so I can finish off in a couple of minutes. As you can see, for example, B1 and B6, like they're just very, very close. Historically, they were probably just built too close to the floodplain. And in this case here, the grading is very shallow. So again, some potential of berming in and around the house. You probably have to do it in kind of a U shape. And then there are a couple of industrial properties. Not so much the building itself, but all the storage location and the parking lots. Now it is different because you can allow some flooding in a parking lot. Typically there's 20 centimeters or 30 centimeters before cars are damaged, as long as the velocities aren't too significant. So there's different things you can do in parking lots and different regulations. Again, the last couple I have, again, as you can see here, there's the stream, and basically the house or the building is directly adjacent to it. And the same thing over with this one over here. So that's all I have, and I'll turn it over, I guess, to Steve, I think.
Yeah, we'll pass things along to Steve. It's Glenn here again, the facilitator, the independent facilitator for the meeting. While Steve's getting his presentation up and ready, I'll just remind everybody that if you do have questions, please send them through the Q&A function and do send them as they occur to you. Thank you. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Dave. Let me just queue up my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes, I can see it, Steve.
Okay. Good evening, folks. My name's Steve Miller. I'm the Senior Manager of Water Resources with the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, and we're going to talk a little bit about what has changed between the floodplain mapping that was done in 1989 and the recent update. So 89, a lot happened in 89. A couple of snapshots. We see a sweet Camaro there. In 1989, Rain Man won Movie of the Year. The top song of the year was Phil Collins. Of course, the Berlin Wall came down, and that desk computer looks like mine at home. All right, let's start on the west side. Beamsville Creek is also known as Konkle Creek. It has 2 names. What you see, we've got a bunch of colors here. And so the purple line is the new floodplain mapping, the one that was updated by Dave's firm Aquifer Beach. The blue tone, is the old 1989 floodplain. The green that you see is the areas that are now outside of the floodplain as a result of the updated floodplain mapping. And the red areas that we find are now areas that are included. The new updated floodplain mapping has expanded over what we seen in 1989. Now, south of the rail tracks, not a lot has changed. We've got generally, you see some additions, some subtractions, and you have to remember we're looking at far better mapping that we have today than we had 30 years ago. Far more powerful computers, an extended period of rainfall record. But all that said, we really don't see a big change. Let's head upstream. Okay, Lincoln Avenue. Dave talked a little bit about this. So Lincoln Avenue between Green Lane and King Street. This whole area was built on a snooker table. You take a snooker table and you tilt it up so everything flows to the top of the screen, flows north. That's what we find happening here. The old 1989 floodplain showed that stuff was going all over Lincoln Street. It was all over the place, much like we find today. Now, I'd like to direct you, we see the word spill at a couple of places. Spills are special areas. They're areas opposed to the traditional floodplain, which is contained in a valley, and spill areas are these areas that they're uncontained, they're shallow, and they flow across the landscape, they go all over the place. They're special areas, and the distinction lies with the Conservation Authority's policies. Spill areas are far more permissive. You're allowed to do things in spill areas provided you floodproof, because the floodplain is uncontained and very shallow at these locations. So starting the very far left, the westernmost tributary of Beamsville Creek, that was not floodplain mapped in 1989. That's why it's showing up red. It flows through predominantly agricultural areas, not a lot of impact there. Moving to the east, moving to the right, we see Lincoln Avenue, how water flows on either side of the roadside ditches. It spills down Lincoln Street, it spills to the east. And over to the far right-hand side, the channel, that portion of Beamsville Creek is in a fairly deep channel. There's been some work on it. It's been realigned over the past years. This town's invested a lot in it, and you can see that the floodplain mapping really hasn't changed for that portion of the watercourse that borders that subdivision. Moving on, proceeding upstream again. The old 1989 floodplain mapping stopped just upstream of King Street. We've extended it down the tributaries that run adjacent to Hillview Drive, Stadelbauer Drive. They're showing up red, but typically these floodplains are contained within the valley systems. The folks living around Stadelbauer and Hillview know this. So you've got deep valleys that these floodplains are typically contained in. So even though we've mapped them, there's no real impact to the adjacent structures. Jumping over to Bartlett Creek, the next watercourse to the east, we see a little bit more. The floodplain has expanded a little bit more, and we found the flows had increased slightly over the 1989 study. And let's take a look south of the railway tracks. So south of the railway tracks, we find an expanded floodplain, but that's typically in agricultural areas and areas behind the industrial developments on Bartlett Road. We go north of the QEW, and again through agricultural areas. There is some impacts around Acres Trace. Dave talked about that. Typically structures constructed close to the watercourse. Heading south of the railway tracks, we see the railway tracks and the culverts under it forming a bottleneck. We've got the floodwaters spilling to the west, down Bartlett Road. And let's just take the next slide, walking upstream. We can see one of those areas that David mentioned where the watercourse was realigned with approval from the Conservation Authority. We start going through the lands around Dennis Avenue, and we see not really a lot of change. And that's not surprising, because that subdivision was designed with the 100-year floodplain in mind to contain that. And we see, again, typical, the updated stuff is in conformity with the older 89 stuff. Let's take a look down by RJ. The old 1989 floodplain mapping, the watercourses at the time were open. Now we see that there's been some realignment, especially around RJ. There's been storm sewers. That watercourse has been put into a storm sewer. So this is an area where that updated floodplain mapping that was undertaken better reflects what's actually on the landscape. Let's pop on to the next slide. And we can see this. We take a look at the area, No Frills Plaza on King Street. The old floodplain mapping showed that whole area prone to flooding. But that's really not the case. That's really not what's happening here. We see the floodwaters, the floodplain come on up, spill over and around King Street. That whole area in the plaza is a spill area. It's not a confined contained floodplain like the 1989 floodplain mapping study had suggested it to be. We've extended over the old 89 floodplain mapping the extent of our work upstream. That's why you see the big, the red lines kind of heading to the bottom of the page. That's tributaries that hadn't been afforded floodplain mapping before, mostly in areas that hadn't been developed, although in the west around Hickson Street, we see that the floodplain mapping is routing through backyards. We know that. That's been a historic, an area that has historically experienced some form of flooding or another. And again, we see the spill areas, especially the floodplain, the extreme kind of bottom left, spilling up, running north on Hickson Street. Let's just take a look at the next slide. So jumping over to the far east, Prudhommes Creek. Prudhommes Creek runs through Vineland and kind of hits the Great Lake. So south of the QEW, generally the same as the old one. The difference with the old 1989 floodplain mapping was that it was just the easternmost branch, the main branch that was floodplain mapped back in the past. The other two tributaries to the west were not, so that's why you see a heck of a lot of red here. And even on the main branch, we see a wider floodplain, much like Beamsville Creek. This whole area I like to think of as a snooker board. The channels aren't that deep, they're small. The landscape drains from south to north, generally flat, and you get the kind of floodplain that you see here. Broad, generally shallow, most of it running through agricultural areas. So heading upstream, once again, railway tracks, as railway tracks tend to do, form a bottleneck. We see on both sides of the main branch the floodplain spilling on over on the east side to Victoria Ave, to the west, kind of in the agricultural lands that border the railway tracks. We head on up further King Street, Rittenhouse, just north of King Street. Things are generally the same as the 89 stuff, and Rittenhouse, one of the areas that David mentioned. I know the town has been working to with the Conservation Authority and the work that Dave's team has done to replace that Rittenhouse culvert, and they know about those houses that are impacted on either side. So hopefully the work that the town has already undertaken will go a long way towards alleviating that situation. So we went through this at a high level. Folks, I encourage you, go to the website. You see Glenn gave you the website. There it is there. On the website, there's a really neat little feature. Click to see if your house is in the floodplain. You click on that, a Google Maps type browser comes up. It's got the floodplain on. You could dive on in as close as you want. You can see your house. You can see if it's impacted. If you have any questions, by all means, you can give me a call. These presentations will be posted onto this web page up until the middle of January for you to look at, for you to leave comments on. You'll see my information. It's all over the place. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. And that concludes my presentation. There's my contact information. I'll turn it back to Glenn, and we'll look forward to hearing about the Conservation Authority policies and what all this stuff means. Back to you, Glenn.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. So what we'll do now is move things over to David DeLuce again, who's with the NPCA. He'll take us through some of the policies and what that means for individual properties and so forth. But a quick and friendly reminder again, if you haven't already, if you do have a question you'd like to share, please do so using the Q&A function. We've received a number of them already, and we're very appreciative of that. And following this last segment of the presentation, we'll start to open things up and start to address those questions. But David, over to you for the last part of the presentation. Go ahead, David.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. Terrific.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. Go ahead, sir.
Window minimized on me. Okay, thank you, everybody. I appreciate, Steve, that you are looking forward to talking about policies. I'm not, but well, this is what I do every day. So try to get through this part as quickly as possible. Most people find policy kind of boring, so we won't spend too much time on this. So again, my name is David DeLuce. I am the Senior Manager of Planning and Regulation. So if you need to get a permit from the Conservation Authority for something, then it would be my group that you would approach. So first, a little bit of background, legislative context for the Conservation Authority. So where do we get our power to regulate floodplains on the land? We get that from the Conservation Authorities Act and specifically Section 28. Now, Section 28 authorizes a conservation authority to develop a regulation. And in our case, the regulation is 15506. And that is really the meat and potatoes of what allows us to regulate floodplains. That specifically spells out the standards. In other words, the 100-year floodplain is the standard. You heard that mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So that is the standard that we regulate up to. And again, that's found subsection 2.1 of our regulation. So that prohibits development in a floodplain. And then subsection 3.1 of the regulation is what allows for permission to develop. Now, also conservation authorities, we have some other powers that are found in the Planning Act itself through section 3, which is the section that allows for the province to pass what are called provincial policy statements. And I'm sure everyone's may have heard of something called the provincial policy statement. That's what municipalities use every time they make a planning decision. They have to be consistent with that. Conservation authorities have a memorandum of understanding with the provincial government to comment on behalf of the province under section 3.1, which is natural hazards. So some more background on policies. The Conservation Authority, in addition to our regulation to the provincial policy, we have our own policy document. And that was recently approved, relatively recent now, 2018. And it underwent an extensive public consultation process and stakeholder consultation process. And the policies, they provide context for why we regulate floodplains. The main reason being our job as a conservation authority, our mandate is to protect people and property from hazards such as floodplains, as well as other natural hazards, Great Lakes hazards, valley erosion areas, and areas that are susceptible to erosion or hazard lands. Our policy document also provides requirements if we're looking to establish a 2-zone floodplain. And basically that is an area where you could have one area that's called a flood fringe, where there would be certain types of development, limited type of development that would be allowed, and then something called the floodway, which is basically the main floodplain, and development is most prohibited in that area. And our policies are what we use to guide our decision making. So that's whether we're commenting on a Planning Act approval circulated to us, or if we're reviewing a permit sent in to our office by a private landowner looking for permission to do something on their property in an area that we regulate. So first thing to clarify, people think that if your property has floodplain on it, that it's completely sterilized, that you can't do anything, and that is not the case. There are some uses that can be done. So first of all, passive open space uses, those type of uses are allowed within the floodplain. You still require approval from us, and that's maybe something to clarify on all of these. You still require approval from the Conservation Authority, but these are the type of proposals that we could entertain. Accessory structures, now subject to certain criteria, so size limitations, making sure that there's no impact to any other properties with respect to the floodplain. Additions to existing buildings. So again, we recognize that there are situations where there's existing houses within a floodplain or other buildings that are already located in the floodplain. And our policies are set up so that we can entertain basically up to a 500 square foot addition to an existing structure, again, subject to certain criteria. Up to 50 cubic meters of clean fill, so basically fill placement within the floodplain, that can be entertained. Once you get above 50 cubic meters, you get into a different area where it's considered large fill placement, and that's subject to a different set of policies that requires a more rigorous test to make sure that there's not going to be any impacts to the floodplain, specifically on any other properties. More flexibility around cut and fill. And what a cut and fill refers to is if you want to change the location of a floodplain, you can't do it in every situation, but you can, in some situations, you may be able to do what's called a balanced cut and fill. So you would literally fill in a certain area of the floodplain, but you have to take an equal volume of fill out of somewhere that doesn't have floodplain on it presently, and basically you're moving the floodplain to that new area where you've removed the fill. So there, again, not every property has that option. That's something that has to be done by a professional engineer or an Ontario land surveyor, and it's subject to criteria by us. But again, our new policies provided a little more flexibility around that. And then finally, there's a sort of a catch-all section that speaks to other uses. And other uses is basically if there's something that wasn't readily described in the policy, but staff look at it, we run it past our engineer to make sure that there's no concerns with it, or we receive additional information that would help support putting whatever is proposed within the floodplain. That's basically where that would fall under. Now, again, that doesn't mean that anything and everything that gets proposed to us will be supported, but if there is something that wasn't quite captured within the policy framework, and we look at in the context of our regulation, and it's determined that there won't be any negative impact to surrounding properties, and impacts to the use and the property itself are minimal, then it's something, again, that we could entertain issuing a permit for. So what is definitely not allowed? Now, I want to caveat that all of these uses are listed in the provincial policy statement, so that is dictated by the province. So first and foremost, sensitive uses such as hospitals, nursing homes, daycares, basically institutional type uses. Secondly, emergency service facilities, so police stations, fire stations, those type of uses. Uses associated with the disposal, treatment, manufacturing, processing, or storage of hazardous substances. And then finally, any other use or development deemed to be inappropriate based on the objectives stated in section 4.2.1 of the Conservation Authority document. And kind of in the reverse fashion, this is another catch-all that if there's a use that is detrimental to the floodplain or detrimental to surrounding properties, or would be of a significant polluting nature, that there is a policy there that would allow us to reject that permit application. So planning applications. Now, when I speak to planning, that's referring to applications submitted to a municipality, like a zoning bylaw amendment or a plan of subdivision or a minor variance. Those are circulated to the Conservation Authority for comment. So we, again, as I mentioned, we have a memorandum of understanding with the province where we provide comments on the natural hazard section of the provincial policy statement, section 3.1. So we do provide comments under that. Now, there are instances where if an application for a permit is submitted ahead of a planning application, or in some cases a planning application comes in, there are little discrepancies between our regulation and the provincial policy statement and definitions in municipal official plans, and it can lead from time to time. Fortunately, it's not often, but it can happen where you could have a situation where we could support a permit application, but not necessarily a corresponding planning application related to that project. Or conversely, we could support a planning application, but not necessarily the permit application. It's unfortunately because of some of the nuances between two different pieces of legislation. Again, we operate primarily under the Conservation Authorities Act, which has a different definition of development than under the provincial policy statement. Finally, generally speaking, when applications come in for creating new lots within the floodplain, that is generally not supportable. Lot additions, that's a little bit of a gray area. Those may be supported depending on specific circumstances, and making sure that there's generally a buildable footprint within the property outside of the floodplain. That is basically my presentation. So if there are any other questions, I will be happy to field those along with everybody else. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much to the two Daves and to Steve for the very informative presentation. And if you've joined us in progress, you've been listening to NPCA staff members and their consultant take us through an overview presentation. And my name's Glenn Pache. I'm the head of a firm called GLPI, and it's my pleasure tonight to serve as the independent facilitator for the session. And thank you again to all of you for joining us tonight, both for your interest in the topic and for the questions that have already been provided. And we've received a number of them, but if there are others, again, please send them along through the Q&A function. That would be much appreciated. So let's move to some of the questions now. And as I mentioned earlier, as they've been submitted, the NPCA moderators, that is NPCA staff, have been reviewing them to identify those that are similar in nature with a view to addressing duplication. And in some cases, they've been consolidating multiple questions into a single one. So please don't worry if the question asked this evening isn't exactly as you posed it. Again, it may have been combined with one or two others. And as I mentioned, there may not be time to address all of the questions in this session, but I want to assure you that NPCA staff will be covering them, they will be reviewing them, and they will be documented as input to the initiative. So let's get to your questions. And the first one is very topical if you've been following the media recently, and if you have an interest in conservation authorities and what the province is doing. Someone is asking, and I'll just say in advance, Dave DeLuce, this one's probably best put to you, but somebody is saying or asking, does the recent provincial legislation impacting conservation authorities have an impact on or affect any results of this floodplain mapping study and any results that may come from it? David, so is there anything going on with that provincial legislation that would have a direct impact on this study?
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for the question. With respect to the recent changes, so that's referring to, I'm sure people have heard of Bill 229. It was basically part of the fall budget back at the beginning of November. And there are a number of changes proposed to the Conservation Authorities Act that will have impacts on our business. With respect to this floodplain study specifically, I would say there's no direct impacts from that legislation. Now, having said that, one possibility, and this remains to be seen how this will all play out, is there's now new sections regarding provincial, specifically ministers' zoning orders and the ability of the province to be able to, similar to what they can already do under the Planning Act, go in and tell the Conservation Authority that, okay, you are going to issue a permit for a specific proposal and you have no choice in the matter but to issue it. You can possibly put conditions in to mitigate any impacts as a result of it, but even if it's contrary to our regulation, our policies, the province can require us to go ahead and issue that permit. So that's one section that, in theory, if there's a proposal that is in lands impacted by the new flood lines, the province could require us to issue a permit on that. But that's something we don't anticipate seeing a lot of, and that would have to be preceded by what's called the Minister's Zoning Order under the Planning Act. So it won't be something necessarily out of the blue. It would have to go through the municipal process first, and then it'll come to us.
Great. Thanks, David. Let me put this next question to Steve Miller. Again, for those of you who have joined us in progress, Steve is the project manager on this initiative for with the NPCA. And Steve, I think somebody's looking for confirmation of something, and they're asking more specifically, can you please confirm that the finalized modeling will be revised to reflect both as-built and approved municipal capital and private creek relocation and culvert improvement projects? So will the project be taking those into account? Go ahead, Steve.
Yep. Thanks for the question, Glenn. The short answer is yes. I can confirm that they will be taken into account. And the updated floodplain mapping looks at the entire broad water courses, 3 in this case, but there are certain site-specific areas that things have changed. Things have changed with the permission of the Conservation Authority. So in those areas, the new floodplain mapping will indeed reflect what the Conservation Authority has permitted.
Thanks, Steve. Maybe I'll go back to David DeLuce for this one, but others might want to jump in as well if this is more appropriately directed to others. And I know, David, that you can't speak on behalf of the town of Lincoln, but someone is asking, will the town of Lincoln be undertaking a comprehensive zoning bylaw update to reflect hazards that might be, hazard lands rather, that might be associated with the updated flood limits? And again, I know you're not a municipal employee there, David, but are you aware of anything? Do you have any insight to add in response to that question?
Yeah, again, thank you for the question. I'll have to double check to see where the town of Lincoln's zoning bylaw, comprehensive zoning bylaw update stands. I believe they were in the process of doing that at least a year ago, but I haven't been involved in that process for a little bit, so I'm not sure where it stands. But short answer is, at some point, yes, the town would have to update its zoning bylaw to reflect the floodplain mapping. They have several options of how they can do that. They could do it as part of a housekeeping amendment that would specifically look at that particular change, the floodplain mapping changes. Or they could, if their comprehensive zoning bylaw process is still open, it could be grouped in under that process. So I would have to look into it with the town to see where that stands, but I would encourage whoever had asked the question to also follow up with the town to find out if they're going to be, where that comprehensive zoning process stands, and to make sure that they incorporate the updated mapping from us once that's approved by our board of directors.
No, that's good advice, David. People should probably contact Lincoln directly. Do you know if there's anything on their website about this? Again, you may not. I'm just checking in with you to see if you're aware of any updates that might be posted there.
Yeah, I don't recall the exact web address, the URL, but if you go onto the town's website and search comprehensive zoning bylaw, I believe there was a dedicated page to it. Or at the very least, it'll take you to a page that has the various reports and background studies that form part of that process.
Great. Thanks, David. So Steve, this next one probably comes back to you. And I don't know if it's so much as a question as it is somebody wants to impart some information and make sure that you're aware of it. So if you can let them know if you are, that I think would be much appreciated. Someone is saying that there are culverts missing immediately north of the property on the east side of Bartlett Road. And they've said in brackets the location where the channel relocation was revised. And then they've also said, in addition, the creek passes below one of the buildings, which was not identified as a restricted location within the draft modeling. So is that ringing true to you? Do you have any comments on that? Go ahead, Steve.
Absolutely. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, the area on the east side of Bartlett Road was one of those areas that the landscape was reworked with the approval of a Conservation Authority permit. So things that you see there that might not show up on the updated floodplain mapping were indeed taken into account during that channel realignment. The location of the floodplain in that area will show up on the Conservation Authority's final floodplain as was approved under the Conservation Authority permit. So that's a little bit of the difference. But thanks for the input. Thanks for the question.
And you were aware of that information that was sent along. That's good to know.
Correct, yes.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So next question, and David DeLuce, maybe back to you with this one. There is a municipal Class EA currently underway with respect to the flooding at Rittenhouse Road. Can the NPCA provide the draft recommendations from this study as comments to the EA? Are you aware of that? Where do things stand? Take it from there. Go ahead.
Yep. Again, thank you for the question. Yeah, I am aware of the the specific EA process that's going on for that particular project. And Steve, I'm going to just kind of defer to you. I'm assuming that we wouldn't have any problem with releasing the draft recommendations from the report, on the understanding that those are draft and nothing has been approved by our board at this time.
That's right. David, what I can confirm is the Conservation Authority has been working with the town and their consultant on that area on Rittenhouse. And so we've shared some of the preliminary recommendations that came out of this study. You got to remember that the recommendations for sizing are kind of high level and preliminary. Therefore, they're to give the municipality an idea of the magnitude and scope of what is perhaps in front of them. And they're always at the design stage subject to refinement. So yes, we already have been in contact with the town and their consultants.
So Steve or David, maybe either of you or both of you want to jump in on this next one as well. Somebody is asking, can a stormwater management facility such as a wet pond be in a floodplain? And while that, I guess, suggests a yes or no response, and we'd appreciate that, if you could give us a little bit of context as to why it is or isn't, that would be, I think, helpful for those who may be attending this information session as well. So either or both of you, please jump in on that one.
Yeah, maybe Steve, I'll start off and then you can comment after. But based on our policies, we don't have anything that specifically prohibits, for example, a stormwater pond from being in a floodplain. Again, it's subject to the idea that it's not going to have a negative impact. It would fit into that sort of catch-all policy I alluded to earlier. Now, this is where I would ask Steve to weigh in, depending on what the purpose of a stormwater pond is for. If it's trying to do stormwater quality treatment versus quantity treatment, that has implications if it's located in the floodplain. And maybe Steve, I'll hand it off to you here.
Thanks, David. We'll make an engineer out of you yet. So the answer is it depends. A stormwater management facility that's constructed to provide flood control is required to be outside of the floodplain. It does no good being located within the floodplain. It can't do its job. A stormwater management facility, on the other hand, that's constructed solely for quality control, and these we typically see near the very close to a watercourse's outlet, where the need for flood control is not required, because we simply want to get the water off the site and into the creek in advance of the big flood wave coming from upstream. In the case of a quality-only pond, yes, there it is possible to construct one within the floodplain. Again,
Great.
subject to all technical rules and requirements being satisfied.
Thank you, gentlemen. So again, I'm not sure who might be best on this one. It might be you, Steve. It might be David, but somebody is wondering what impact a change in the flood lines, assuming there was one on their individual personal property, what impact that might have on homeowner insurance policies. Again, if the flood lines are modified or increased in size, and I'm taking this question as meaning if they've expanded sort of onto one's property, does that change how much I might, for example, have to pay, or the terms of the insurance and so forth? Are either of you able to tackle that one?
David, you want me to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, please. So in order to determine the impact, I would encourage you to chat with your insurance agency. But what I can tell you, overland flood insurance in Ontario is a very new thing, and insurance agencies are wrestling with how to provide that. In the absence of any kind of detailed study, the insurance companies are typically relying on postal codes. They identify a watercourse, what's the postal code around it, and for lack of any better information, set the rates accordingly. With the work that the Conservation Authority is doing to update our floodplain mapping, it's posted on our website. It's freely available to anyone, including the insurance companies, who can use that information to more accurately assess the risk to a property. Again, how it impacts you, I would encourage you to talk to your individual insurance agency.
David, anything to add?
I agree with Steve. The best place to find an answer is to talk to your local, your insurance broker and find out what the implications are for your specific situation.
Okay, thank you. So just a reminder, everybody, if you do have questions, please send them in using the Q&A function. I know a number of you joined us this evening, mostly to hear the presentation and to better understand what the study is all about and to understand where you can go now to get more information and to share comments and so forth. But I do encourage you, we're at about 7:20 right now, to send in any other questions you might have if they're kind of just even in the backs of your minds. This is a great opportunity to share them this evening. We've got some really knowledgeable people here who can hopefully address them for you. We've got a few more though at this point, and David, maybe this one is best put to you. Some people are wondering about the issue of agriculture and whether one can farm in a floodplain. So can you give us a bit of the context and background there and the answer to the question, of course?
Sure. Good question. The short answer is yes. If you're doing normal farm practices, so typical cultivating of land, where you're not adding significant volumes of fill, you're not maybe just top dressing the field, but just simple crops, that's totally fine. You know, everybody understands that that's from time to time will flood, but again, we don't have any prohibition on that. Agricultural buildings, we are a little more flexible with agricultural buildings, so those are something that can be entertained, but the larger the building becomes, there's going to be more rigor in terms of demonstrating no negative impact to the floodplain. And it has to be a building that by its nature is not susceptible to any sort of major damage or is not going to be storing anything that would be hazardous or detrimental to the floodplain or would be subject to expensive damage if it were to be flooded. But again, short answer is yes, we can entertain things, agricultural type uses within the floodplain, still subject to Conservation Authority approval in the form of a permit.
Great. Thanks, David. Let's get the other Dave back in. We haven't heard from him in a while. So Dave Monder, this question is for you. Somebody is wondering about your firm and its background and how many of these types of studies you've done, and more specifically, whether you came across anything in this study that perhaps was a little bit atypical, a little bit unique, a little bit unusual, or was it pretty much standard? And I know you're a guy who's probably done a lot of these, but go ahead, Dave.
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, our firm has been doing this type of work across Ontario for probably 30 years. There's nothing particularly unique. The floodplain mapping protocol has been in place for a number of decades. The unique thing here, I think, is that we're in one of the flatter areas of Ontario, so any small obstruction in a culvert being too small or whatever, as Steve showed, does cause or create some fairly expansive floodplains. But again, the process of doing detailed field work, the hydrology and hydraulics is pretty standardized throughout the province.
And Dave, while I've got you, you had talked earlier about perhaps putting in, or the possibility of there being larger culverts and so forth. Some people are wondering, what's the process for making that happen? And if they were installed, would it then have an impact on the flood lines themselves?
Yeah, so if you install, I'll answer the second part first. If you install a larger culvert, basically it would reduce the floodplain, but only upstream of where the culvert is, not downstream of it. The actual process, and I think Steve alluded to it, we're trying to provide reasonable sizes, and this information is useful for two reasons. If someone wants to get their property or their house out of the floodplain, that's the first thing. And if and when municipalities go ahead, like someone mentioned with the Rittenhouse Road EA, then there's useful information there for the municipalities to use to try and figure out what proper size of culvert should be put in.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. And Steve, maybe this one's best put to you. Someone was wondering, When are the floodplain lines revisited? Is there a set schedule, much like an official plan needs to be updated every X number of years? Is there a set timeline for reviewing the floodplain lines?
No, thanks for the question, Glenn. So in the NPCA's jurisdiction, we have over 130 watercourses. Some of them flow through primarily farm fields. Others flow through areas that are experiencing rapid development and intensification. We try and target those areas. We take a look at our the vintage of our floodplain maps, try and overlay that with the areas that are experiencing big development pressure. And in those areas, if those floodplain maps are out of date, then we would look to update them to help the municipality better plan the land use, the development, and to help the development community who is looking to potentially purchase lands. The last thing you want to do is to purchase a land and find it encumbered by floodplain. So the short answer to that would be typically 15 years-ish, depending upon the scope, nature, and location of the floodplain, we start thinking about providing an update.
And and I'm just, looking at some of the greater detail in the question, if there were to be some new developments in terms of, some new formulas, some new ways of calculating flood lines that were to come out in the intervening time period, would that prompt a quicker review, or is that not likely at all in the first place? And maybe Dave Monder or Steve, either of you jump in.
Well, I'll take it first, Dave, and feel free to add to it. So the Conservation Authority, we have a floodplain mapping program that we're implementing. Again, over 130 watercourses, there's a lot of work to be done. If someone, whether they be, a private landowner or a big developer, is looking to do things and there is no floodplain mapping, they have two options. One, if they have the luxury of time, they can wait until the Conservation Authority gets to that section of watercourse, undertakes the floodplain mapping, and makes those results freely available. If, on the other hand, they don't have the luxury of time, then the developer or the individual landowner can retain their own consulting engineer to generate the flood lines at their own cost. Of course, they'd send them in to the Conservation Authority would review them, and once we're happy with them, then we'd say, yes, we agree, this is the extent of the floodplain on that property. So really two scenarios. You can wait for the Conservation Authority to do it and pay for it, or if you don't have the luxury of time, then look to retain a consulting engineer to get it done on your behalf.
Dave, did you have anything you wanted to add? Dave Monder?
No, I think the benefit of having it is, as Steve mentioned, you can answer questions with respect to existing properties or future development, which we really didn't get into much tonight. But.
Okay. So a few more questions, and then perhaps we'll wrap up a little bit early this evening, which I think no one will complain about and probably appreciate. To Dave Monder, some people are wondering, and I know you touched on this earlier, whether surveys and measurements were done in the field, and more than that, what was the nature of these? How extensive were they, and so forth, as you worked on the study?
So you start off, thanks, Glenn, you start off with what's called topographic mapping, which is probably accurate to within maybe half a meter plus or minus. So if it tells you the elevation is 100, it's probably 99.5 to 100.5. But what we did is we did a very detailed survey of every watercourse crossing. So we measured about 6 or 7 elements: the size of the crossing, the depth of the crossing, what type of crossing it is, inverts at the upstream and downstream end. And that's probably the most important information. And then what we did is we field checked the information to make sure that the topographic information we have was indeed accurate. So we did spot measurements of low flow channels and some cross sections throughout the watercourse lengths.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So David, one more question for you. And God forbid, should a structure, a house on a property fall down, be blown down in the wind. Someone was wondering if it were now in the floodplain, would the person be allowed to rebuild it?
That's a very good question. So the short answer is, like Steve said earlier, it depends. Now, if the house was destroyed because of a flood, then the answer to that would be no, you would not be able to rebuild it on the same spot. You would have to relocate it out of the floodplain. And again, that's because it was destroyed because of a flood, and we're trying to prevent things like that from happening. Now, if it was destroyed fire or some other cause, then we could support rebuilding on the same footprint. We might encourage some additional floodproofing measures depending on what the sort of anticipated level of flooding is for that property. But if somebody's house is destroyed by means other than flooding, it can potentially be rebuilt on the same footprint.
Gotcha. So let me say again, thank you to all of those who submitted questions. I know there were some questions that were more directed to Lincoln and some of the other municipalities, and I think that those will be passed along on your behalf. But thank you to those who shared questions, and thank you as well to our responder panel for addressing them. And though we've been focusing on your questions this evening, please keep in mind that if others occur to you after the session, and that's often the case, sometimes things just come to us a half hour later, an hour later, you can share those questions and of course any comments you might have by visiting the project website. And again, you can also at the website review the draft report, you can look at the associated maps and so forth. And I won't go through that long website address again, but it is an option for you. In addition, of course, you can contact Steve Miller. Again, he's the project manager from NPCA, and his email address is smiller@npca.ca. And that's your best bet if you have any property-specific issues or questions. He'll be able to work with you on them or bring in other members of the NPCA team who can assist. And of course, you can also submit comments by surface mail, or you can drop them off in person at the NPCA offices, which, if you're unaware, is at 250 Thorold Road West in Welland. Now, we did have a couple of questions that came up relating to next steps. And so I'm going to invite Steve Miller now to talk about some next steps and where things go from here. And also to just maybe share any closing observations he might have about the session and about some of the questions that he's heard. But I want to thank you all again for participating. A special thank you to those who shared questions and comments. Again, I want to thank any of our esteemed elected officials and NPCA board members who may have joined us this evening. Thank you both for joining us and, of course, for your ongoing valued service to the community. It's much appreciated. It's been a pleasure from my perspective serving as the facilitator for the session. Always nice to work with such a thoughtful and knowledgeable and articulate group. But over to Steve for some quick observations and an overview of next steps, and then I'll come back to wrap things up.
Thanks, Glenn. And so what I can tell folks is this video will be posted to the website. You feel free to share it with your friends, watch it again. Submit your comments. Comments will be able to be submitted whether by mail or on the project website, email to me until mid-January, roughly January 15th. Once that date passes, we'll take all those comments, we'll sift through them, we'll look at them, we'll revise things as appropriate, and then we'll make a presentation of this whole public engagement session to the Conservation Authority's Public Advisory Committee. That'll happen at the end of January. Once we present to the Public Advisory Committee, we'll be looking in February to present this entire thing, the entire package, the public engagement session, our meeting with the Public Advisory Committee, to the Conservation Authority's Board of Directors, again in February. We'll be looking to have the Board of Directors formally endorse this floodplain mapping project. Once that floodplain mapping project is formally endorsed by the Board of Directors, then the Conservation Authority can proceed to update all the mapping that you see online, and we will start using that updated floodplain mapping to administer our floodplain regulations. So that's kind of the broad overview of where we're going from here. We're looking to have this project wrapped up very early in the new year.
Thanks, Steve. So just a few things before I formally adjourn the session. As a reminder, again, I know I've said it a few times, but I do encourage you, if you have the time and if you are so inclined, to take the opportunity to visit the NPCA project webpage. There's a lot of good information there that I think you will find of value. And there's also an opportunity through the website to share questions, to share comments, again, that might occur to you post-session. So thank you to the various personnel who made this session possible. Thank you to our technical manager, Sebastian, and thank you to all of you for your participation and your interest in the topic. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Take care, stay safe. Good night.